She begged for death with tears streaming down her face. But the Comanche warrior, standing before her, did something that would change both their lives forever. The Texas sun burned without mercy on that autumn day in 1867. The sky stretched endlessly blue, not a cloud to offer shade, not a whisper of wind to cool the blood-soaked earth. Caroline Wells, just 19 years old, knelt in the dirt with her hands bound behind her back. Her dress, once a modest blue calico her mother had sewn by candlelight, was now torn and stained with dust and crimson. Her long auburn hair had come loose from its braid, falling across her face in tangled strands that stuck to her tear-streaked cheeks. The rope around her wrists had cut so deep that blood trickled down her palms, dripping onto the dry ground beneath her. Every breath she took came with a sharp pain in her ribs, where one of the outlaws had kicked her when she tried to resist. Around her, the homestead that had been her family's dream lay in ruins. Smoke still rose from the burned timber of the barn, black columns against the bright sky. The fence her father had spent 3 summers building was shattered, rails scattered like broken bones across the prairie. The vegetable garden her mother had tended with such care was trampled into mud. The carefully planted rows of squash and beans crushed under careless boots and horse hooves. The chicken coop lay splintered, the few surviving hens scattered into the brush. And in the yard, near the well where Carrie had drawn water every morning since she was old enough to carry a bucket, lay the bodies of everyone she had ever loved. Her father, Thomas Wells, a good man who had believed in the promise of new land and had brought his family west with hope in his heart. Her mother, Margaret, who had sung hymns while she worked and who had never spoken an unkind word to anyone. Her younger brother, Daniel, only 12, who had wanted nothing more than to grow tall enough to ride his father's horse and who collected smooth stones from the creek to keep in his pockets. Carrie had watched them fall. She had heard the gunshots crack through the morning air like thunder, had seen the raiders come thundering across the plain in a cloud of dust. They were not Comanche. They were white men, outlaws, the kind who wore no badge and followed no law but greed and violence. They had come for the Wells family's horses, their supplies, maybe the small savings Thomas had hidden in a tin beneath the floorboards of their modest cabin. When Thomas had tried to reason with them, stepping forward with his hands raised and his voice calm, their leader, a man with a scar running from his eye to his jaw like a lightning strike, had shot him where he stood without a moment's hesitation. Margaret had screamed, a sound that tore through the morning like a blade, and they had silenced her too with a casual brutality that made Carrie's stomach turn. Daniel had tried to run, his young legs pumping as he raced toward the creek where he might hide in the tall grass, but they had cut him down before he reached the water. His small body had fallen face first into the dirt, and he had not moved again. Carrie had been in the root cellar when the shooting started. She had been fetching potatoes for breakfast, humming the same hymn her mother always sang while she kneaded bread. The cellar was cool and dark, smelling of earth and stored vegetables. By the time she climbed the ladder and pushed open the heavy wooden door, it was already over. The morning had been so ordinary just moments before, filled with the promise of another day of work and family and simple joys. Now it was shattered beyond repair. The outlaws had spotted her immediately as she emerged, blinking in the sudden brightness. They had laughed as they dragged her into the open, their hands rough and reeking of whiskey and sweat. One of them, a young man with cold blue eyes and a cruel mouth, had pressed a pistol to her temple and asked the scarred leader what they should do with her. His breath had been hot against her ear, and she had felt the cold metal of the gun barrel pressing into her skin, hard enough to bruise. The leader had looked her over with the same expression a man might give a horse at auction, assessing her worth with eyes that made her skin crawl. He had grinned, showing teeth stained brown from tobacco, and said they would take her with them. His voice had been rough as gravel, and there had been something in his tone that made the other men laugh in a way that turned Carrie's blood to ice. Carrie had fought with every ounce of strength in her body. She had clawed at their faces, kicked at their shins, screamed until her voice went hoarse, and her throat felt like it was on fire. But there were 5 of them, and she was alone, just a young woman who had never known violence before this day. They had tied her hands behind her back so tight the rope bit into her flesh, and they had thrown her onto the back of a horse like a sack of grain. Then they had ridden west, away from the homestead, away from the graves that would never be dug, away from everything she had known and loved in her short life. They rode for hours under the merciless sun. The heat pressed down like a physical weight, making it hard to breathe. Carrie's wrists burned where the rope cut into her skin, the rough fibers rubbing the wounds raw with every movement of the horse. Her body ached from being bounced against the hard saddle, her legs cramping from the awkward position they had forced her into. The outlaws spoke among themselves as they rode, their voices low and cruel, making plans for what they would do once they reached their camp somewhere in the wild territories. Carrie heard enough to know that her suffering had only just begun, that what awaited her was worse than anything she could imagine. She prayed silently, desperately, for God to take her before they could do what they planned. She prayed for her family, hoping they had not suffered long, hoping they were at peace now in heaven. She prayed for her own soul, because she did not know if she would survive what was coming, and if she did survive, she did not know what would be left of her. The landscape changed as they rode deeper into Comanche territory. The flat prairie gave way to rolling hills, dotted with mesquite and juniper trees. Rocky outcrops rose from the earth like ancient sentinels, weathered by wind and time. This was wild land, untamed and dangerous, where few white settlers dared to venture without a well-armed party. The outlaws seemed unconcerned by the risk. They laughed and passed a bottle between them, their confidence born from guns and numbers and a lifetime of taking what they wanted without consequence. But Carrie felt the weight of unseen eyes watching from the hills. She had heard stories of the Comanche, tales whispered in fear around campfires and dinner tables in settlements along the frontier. They were warriors, fierce and unforgiving, masters of this harsh land who had fought the Spanish and the Mexicans, and now the Americans. Some said they were ghosts who could appear and vanish like smoke on the wind. Others said they were devils who showed no mercy to those who trespassed on their hunting grounds. The settlers spoke of them with a mixture of fear and grudging respect, acknowledging that this was their land long before any white man had set foot on it. By late afternoon, the outlaws stopped near a dry creek bed to water the horses at a small spring that still held moisture. The scarred leader dismounted with a grunt, his joints cracking audibly. He pulled Carrie down from the horse without ceremony, and she collapsed to her knees in the dirt, too exhausted to stand. Her legs had gone numb from hours of riding, and sharp pins and needles shot through them as blood began to flow again. He crouched in front of her, his breath hot and foul, as he tilted her chin up with one dirty finger, forcing her to meet his eyes. He told her she had better get used to her new life, because she belonged to them now, and if she was smart, she would learn to do what she was told without causing trouble. His voice was almost conversational, as if he were discussing the weather. Carrie gathered what moisture she could in her dry mouth and spat in his face. The blow came swift and hard, his fist connecting with her cheekbone, with a sound like a tree branch snapping. Stars exploded across her vision, and she tasted blood as her teeth cut the inside of her mouth. She fell sideways into the dirt, her ears ringing. The other men laughed, but it was a nervous laughter, as if they were not entirely comfortable with what they were doing, but would not speak against their leader. But their laughter died in an instant, cut off as suddenly as if someone had closed a door. A sound cut through the air, high and sharp and primal, a war cry that made the blood run cold and the hair stand up on the back of the neck. The outlaws spun around, reaching for their weapons with fumbling hands, but it was already too late. Comanche warriors emerged from the rocks and brush with deadly speed, moving like shadows given form and purpose. There were 6 of them, painted for war, their faces marked with ochre and black in patterns that were both beautiful and terrifying. They rode bareback on painted ponies, their movements fluid and precise, as if horse and rider were one creature instead of 2. Arrows flew through the air with barely a whisper, finding their targets with brutal accuracy that spoke of years of training and countless hunts. One outlaw fell with an arrow through his throat, his hands clutching at the shaft as blood bubbled from his mouth and he made horrible choking sounds. Another tried to fire his rifle, bringing it up with shaking hands, but a tomahawk buried itself in his skull with a wet thud before he could pull the trigger. He was dead before he hit the ground. The scarred leader grabbed Carrie by her hair, his fingers tangling in the auburn strands and pulling so hard tears sprang to her eyes. He dragged her up to her feet, using her as a shield between himself and the warriors. He pressed his pistol against her temple, the metal still warm from being in the sun, and shouted at the Comanche to stay back or he would kill her. His voice shook despite his bravado, the tremor betraying his fear. The Comanche warriors circled them on horseback, silent now, their eyes cold and measuring as they assessed the situation. Carrie's heart hammered in her chest so hard she thought it might burst. She did not know if these men had come to save her or if she was simply exchanging one nightmare for another. She had heard what the Comanche did to captives, stories of torture and slavery and fates worse than death. The stories were not kind, and she had no reason to believe they were exaggerations. One warrior rode forward, separating himself from the others with a subtle gesture. He was taller than the rest, his body lean and hard with muscle, marked with scars that told stories of battles fought and survived. His long black hair was adorned with feathers and bone beads, and his face was painted with white and black stripes that made him look like a spirit of death itself. His eyes, dark and piercing as a hawk's, locked onto the scarred leader with an intensity that made the outlaw flinch despite himself. This warrior carried a lance decorated with scalps and feathers, each one a trophy from a fallen enemy, and at his side hung a knife with a bone handle worn smooth from years of use. He wore leggings decorated with intricate beadwork, and a breastplate made of bone pipes that clicked softly as he moved. Around his neck hung a necklace of bear claws. He spoke no English, but his meaning was clear in the way he held himself, in the way he gestured with his lance. "Let her go." The outlaw tightened his grip on Carrie's hair, making her cry out in pain. His pistol shook against her head, and she could feel his hand trembling. He yelled that he would do it, that he would kill her if they came any closer, his voice rising in pitch as panic set in. But the Comanche warrior did not move. He simply sat on his horse, unblinking, as if he could see straight through the outlaw's bluster to the coward beneath. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, broken only by the harsh breathing of the outlaw and the occasional stamp of a horse's hoof. Carrie could feel the outlaw's hand trembling against her head, could smell the fierce sweat pouring off him. And then, in one fluid motion that was almost too fast to follow, the warrior threw his lance. It flew through the air with perfect accuracy, a blur of wood and metal, piercing the outlaw's shoulder and sending him stumbling backward with a scream of agony. His pistol discharged into the dirt with a bang that made Carrie's ears ring, and she fell free, hitting the ground hard enough to knock the wind from her lungs. The remaining outlaws broke and ran like rabbits flushed from cover. They scrambled for their horses in a blind panic, their earlier bravado completely gone. But the Comanche were faster, their ponies responding to the slightest touch as if reading their riders' thoughts. Arrows and tomahawks found their marks with deadly efficiency, and within moments the only sounds were the dying gasps of men who had lived by violence and now met their end by it. The scarred leader lay on the ground, clutching his wounded shoulder, blood pooling beneath him and soaking into the thirsty earth. The tall warrior dismounted in one smooth motion and walked over to him with deliberate slowness, his footsteps measured and purposeful. He pulled his lance free from the outlaw's shoulder, and the man screamed, a high-pitched sound of pure agony. Then, with cold efficiency and no hesitation, the warrior ended his suffering with a swift cut across the throat. The scarred leader's eyes went wide, then empty, and he was still. Carrie lay in the dirt, her bound hands beneath her, her body shaking uncontrollably with shock and exhaustion and terror. She waited for the warriors to turn on her, to finish what the outlaws had started, to exact whatever revenge they took on white trespassers in their territory. But instead, the tall warrior approached her slowly, his movements careful and deliberate, as if approaching a wounded animal that might bolt or attack. He knelt beside her in the dirt, his painted face unreadable, neither cruel nor kind. Up close, she could see the scars that crisscrossed his chest and arms, the marks of a life lived in constant battle. There was a particularly nasty scar running from his collarbone down across his ribs, raised and pale against his bronze skin. His eyes, however, held something she did not expect. Not cruelty, not hunger, not the cold indifference she had seen in the outlaws' faces, but something closer to curiosity, perhaps even concern. He studied her face as if trying to understand something. He reached for her bound hands with his knife, and Carrie flinched, unable to stop herself. But his touch was gentle as he cut through the ropes with careful precision, making sure the blade did not nick her already damaged skin. The moment her hands were free, blood rushed back into her fingers, bringing sharp, tingling pain that made her gasp. She clutched her wrists, seeing the deep grooves the rope had left, the raw flesh weeping blood. The warrior watched her for a moment longer, his expression thoughtful, then stood and spoke to his companions in their language. The words were rhythmic and strange to her ears, full of sounds she had never heard before, but the tone was calm, authoritative. The other warriors nodded and set about gathering the outlaws' horses and weapons, stripping the dead of anything useful with practiced efficiency. Carrie tried to stand on shaking legs, but her body betrayed her. She had not eaten since breakfast the morning before, had barely drunk any water in the scorching heat, and the terror of the last day had drained every ounce of strength from her body. Her vision swam, dark spots dancing at the edges, and she collapsed back to the ground with a small cry of frustration and despair. The tall warrior turned back to her, and for a moment their eyes met directly. In that brief exchange, something passed between them. An understanding without words, a recognition of shared humanity despite the vast gulf between their worlds. He gestured to one of the other warriors, a younger man with kind eyes, who brought forward a waterskin made of animal hide. The tall warrior offered it to Carrie with a slight inclination of his head. She hesitated, her mind screaming warnings about accepting anything from these men, but her thirst was overwhelming, her mouth so dry, her tongue felt like leather. She took the skin with trembling hands and drank deeply, the water cool and life-giving, better than anything she had ever tasted. When she lowered the water skin, water dripping down her chin, she found the warrior still watching her with that same thoughtful expression. He said something in his language, his voice low and steady, the words flowing like water over stones. She did not understand the words, but she understood the gesture that followed. He pointed to the north, then to himself and his men, then back to her. They were taking her with them. Carrie's heart sank like a stone. She had escaped the outlaws only to become a captive again, only to face an uncertain fate with these warriors whose language she did not speak and whose customs she did not know. But what choice did she have? She was alone in the wilderness, miles from the nearest settlement, unarmed, with no food or shelter or means of survival. Her family was dead, her home destroyed, everything she had known burned to ash. There was nowhere to run, no one to save her, no path back to the life she had known. The warrior seemed to sense her despair in the way her shoulders slumped and her eyes dropped to the ground. He reached out slowly, telegraphing his movement so as not to startle her, and placed a hand on her shoulder. It was not a rough grip like the outlaws had used, not possessive or threatening, but something closer to reassurance. His hand was warm and calloused, the hand of a man who had worked and fought his entire life. Then he straightened to his full height and walked back to his horse, a magnificent paint stallion with a black and white coat that gleamed even through the dust of travel. The horse was clearly his pride, its muscles well-defined, its eyes alert and intelligent. He mounted in one smooth motion that spoke of a lifetime in the saddle and looked back at her. Waiting with patient silence, one of the other warriors, The younger one, who had brought the water, led a smaller brown mare forward. The horse was gentler looking than the warriors' painted ponies, with soft eyes and a calm demeanor. He gestured for Carrie to mount, his movements encouraging but not forceful. She looked at the horse, then at the warriors watching her, then at the empty prairie stretching in every direction like an ocean of grass. The sun was already beginning its descent, and she knew that nightfall in this wilderness would bring dangers she could not face alone. Wolves, cougars, the cold that came after dark, and perhaps more outlaws or hostile forces. She had no other option, no real choice at all. With the last reserves of her strength, gritting her teeth against the pain in her battered body, she pulled herself onto the horse's back. The mare shifted beneath her but did not bolt, as if understanding that her rider was injured and needed gentleness. They rode north as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple and deep crimson. It was beautiful in a way that seemed wrong, given the horrors of the day, as if nature itself was indifferent to human suffering. Carrie clung to the horse's mane with both hands, her body swaying with exhaustion, barely able to keep herself upright. Every movement of the horse sent fresh waves of pain through her bruised ribs and aching muscles. The warriors rode in formation around her, and she gradually realized they were not positioning themselves as captors dragging a prisoner, but as protectors forming a shield around something fragile. The tall warrior rode at the front, his posture straight and commanding, clearly the leader of this small war party. Occasionally he would glance back over his shoulder to check on her, his expression unreadable beneath the war paint that was beginning to streak with sweat. As darkness fell like a curtain across the land, they made camp in a sheltered canyon where a small spring fed a pool of clear water surrounded by cottonwood trees. The location was well chosen, defensible, with high walls on three sides and a clear view of anyone approaching. The warriors dismounted and set about their tasks with practiced efficiency that came from years of traveling and camping together. Some tended to the horses, removing the minimal tack they used and checking hooves for stones. Others gathered wood for a fire, selecting pieces that would burn without creating too much smoke that might give away their position. Two warriors climbed up to the canyon rim with their weapons to stand watch, silhouettes against the darkening sky. The tall warrior approached Carrie and helped her down from the horse with steady hands. Her legs nearly buckled again, muscles cramping and weak, but he steadied her with a firm grip on her arm. He led her to a spot near where they were building the fire and gestured for her to sit on a relatively flat rock. She sank down gratefully, wrapping her arms around herself against the growing chill. The young warrior, who had given her water earlier, brought her a piece of dried meat and a small portion of pemmican, along with more water in a different skin. Carrie took them with a nod of thanks, not trusting her voice, afraid that if she tried to speak, she would break down completely. The meat was tough and heavily salted, the pemmican dense and rich with fat and berries, but it was food, and her body desperately needed it. She had not realized how hungry she was until the first bite, and then she had to force herself to eat slowly rather than gulping it down and making herself sick. She chewed deliberately, watching the warriors as they moved about the camp with fluid coordination. They spoke to each other in low voices, occasionally laughing at some shared joke or memory. In those moments, they seemed almost ordinary, not the fearsome raiders from the settlers' stories, but men resting after a long day of riding and fighting. They cleaned their weapons, tended small wounds, and shared food among themselves with an easy camaraderie that spoke of deep bonds forged through shared hardship. The tall warrior sat across the fire from her once it was properly burning, the flames casting dancing shadows across his painted face. He had removed his bone breastplate and was cleaning his weapons with careful attention, checking the lance for damage, sharpening his knife on a smooth stone with rhythmic strokes. His paint was beginning to fade and smudge, revealing more of the strong lines of his face beneath. He was younger than she had first thought in the heat of battle, perhaps in his late 20s, though the hardness in his eyes spoke of a life that had aged him beyond his years. There was a seriousness to him, a weight of responsibility that she recognized even across the gulf of language and culture. As he worked on his weapons, he would occasionally glance up at her, his gaze thoughtful and assessing, but not threatening. Carrie could not read his intentions, could not guess what fate awaited her in the Comanche camp they were riding toward. Fear still gripped her heart like a cold hand, but beneath it a strange numbness had begun to settle in, a kind of emotional exhaustion that came from too much trauma in too short a time. She had lost everything in a single day, her family, her home, her entire future as she had imagined it. What more could possibly be taken from her? The night grew cold, as it always did in this land, the temperature dropping sharply once the sun disappeared. The warmth of the day fled quickly into the vast sky, and Carrie began to shiver in her torn dress. She had not thought to grab a shawl when she went down to the root cellar that morning, had not known it would be the last normal moment of her life. One of the warriors noticed her shivering and brought her a blanket woven from buffalo hide, thick and warm, and smelling of smoke and animal. She wrapped it around her shoulders gratefully, feeling the warmth seep into her bones and ease some of the shaking. The gesture surprised her. These men had killed the outlaws without hesitation, had stripped the bodies with practiced efficiency, yet they were showing her kindness in small ways. It did not match the stories she had heard, the tales of savage cruelty and merciless violence. Perhaps, she thought, the stories were incomplete. Perhaps, like all people, the Comanche were more complex than simple villains in a settler's tale. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks spiraling up into the vast star-filled sky. There were more stars than Carrie had ever seen, the Milky Way, a river of light across the heavens. In settlements with their lanterns and campfires, you never saw the stars like this. Out here in the wilderness, they blazed with an intensity that was almost frightening in its beauty. Carrie stared into the flames, her mind unable to stop replaying the horrors of the day. Her father's body falling as the bullet struck him, the way he had reached out toward her mother as if he could still protect her. Her mother's scream, cut short with brutal finality. Daniel running, his small legs pumping, so close to the creek where he might have hidden. The images burned behind her eyes like brands, and tears began to fall silently down her cheeks, carving clean tracks through the dirt on her face. She made no sound, but her shoulders shook with suppressed sobs. She did not notice the tall warrior had moved until he was sitting beside her on the ground. She startled, her body tensing instinctively, but he made no threatening move. Instead, he simply sat in silence, staring into the fire as she had been, respecting her grief without trying to stop it or fix it. After a long moment, he spoke. The words were in his own language, soft and rhythmic, almost like a prayer or a song. The cadence was beautiful, despite her not understanding the meaning, rising and falling like water over stones. Carrie did not understand the individual words, but there was something in his tone that felt like comfort, like acknowledgement of loss and pain. It was the voice of someone who had also grieved, who knew what it was to lose people you loved. When he finished speaking, he looked at her directly, and for the first time she saw something clearly human in his eyes beneath the warrior's hardness. Something that told her he, too, had known loss, had buried people he loved, had felt the weight of grief that threatened to crush the spirit. He reached into a pouch at his side and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in soft leather. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a collection of items that were clearly precious to him. A carved wooden figure of a horse, no bigger than his thumb, worn smooth from handling. A small blue stone that caught the firelight. A lock of black hair tied with sinew. He touched each item briefly, reverently, then wrapped them back up and returned the bundle to his pouch. It was a gesture of shared understanding, a way of saying without words that he knew what it meant to carry the memory of lost loved ones. Carrie found herself crying harder, but this time not just from horror and fear. There was something cathartic in being seen in her grief, in having it acknowledged by this stranger who should have been her enemy. The warrior said something else, his voice gentle, then stood and returned to his place across the fire. He wrapped himself in his own blanket and settled into sleep, though she noticed his hand never moved far from his weapons. The other warriors also began to settle for the night, except for the two on watch, who would be relieved in a few hours. The young warrior, who had been kind to her, gave her an encouraging nod before wrapping himself in his blanket near the fire. Slowly, the camp grew quiet, except for the crackling of the fire and the distant call of a night bird. Carrie sat awake for a long time, unable to let go of consciousness despite her exhaustion. She feared what dreams might come, what nightmares would replay behind her closed eyes, but eventually her body's need for rest overcame her fear. She lay down on the ground, still wrapped in the buffalo hide blanket, and curled into herself. The earth was hard beneath her, nothing like her bed at home with its corn-husk mattress and quilts her grandmother had made. Home. The word felt strange now, belonging to a past that seemed impossibly distant, even though it had been only hours ago. She closed her eyes and tried not to think about the fact that she was sleeping in a Comanche camp, surrounded by warriors who could kill her as easily as they had killed the outlaws. But somehow, she did not feel the same immediate threat she had felt with the outlaws. These men were dangerous, certainly, but they were not cruel in the same way. They followed some code she did not understand, but it was a code nonetheless. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. She drifted into an uneasy sleep filled with fragmented dreams. Her mother singing hymns in the kitchen, her father laughing at something Daniel had said, the crack of gunfire, blood on the dirt. Running, always running, but her legs would not move fast enough. She woke several times through the night, disoriented and frightened, only to see the warrior on watch, sitting alert on the canyon rim, silhouetted against the stars. Each time, she would remember where she was and why, and the weight of it would settle on her chest like a stone. But she would also see the fire still burning low, keeping the cold at bay, and the sleeping forms of the warriors around her. And somehow she would drift back into fitful sleep. Dawn came slowly, the sky lightening from black to deep blue to pale gold. Carrie woke to the sounds of the camp stirring, warriors rising and preparing for another day of travel. Her body ached everywhere, muscles stiff from sleeping on the ground and from the beating she had taken. Her face was swollen where the outlaw had hit her, and her wrists were raw and painful. But she was alive. That fact seemed both miraculous and terrible. The tall warrior approached her with more dried meat and water, gesturing for her to eat. His war paint was gone now, washed off in the spring, and she could see his face clearly for the first time. It was a strong face, with high cheekbones and a prominent nose, a face that would be considered handsome by any measure. His eyes in the morning light were a deep brown, almost black, and they watched her with an intensity that made her look away. The warriors broke camp with the same efficiency they had shown in making it, leaving almost no trace of their presence. They helped Carrie onto the brown mare again, and she noticed they had fashioned a crude pad from a blanket to make the riding more comfortable for her. It was another small kindness that confused her understanding of who these men were. They rode throughout the morning, heading steadily north into territory that grew increasingly unfamiliar. The land here was more rugged, with deep arroyos and scattered mesas rising from the plains. They saw herds of buffalo in the distance, dark masses moving across the grassland, and once a small group of pronghorn antelope that bounded away at their approach, moving with impossible grace and speed. Around midday, they stopped to rest the horses and eat. The tall warrior came and sat near Carrie, not crowding her but close enough to speak if they had shared a language. He drew in the dirt with a stick, making simple pictures. A horse, the sun. A dwelling that might have been a teepee. Then he pointed to himself and said a word. It took Carrie a moment to realize he was telling her his name. He repeated it, patient, pointing to himself. It sounded like flowing water, like winter wind. She tried to repeat it, stumbling over the unfamiliar sounds. He smiled slightly, the first smile she had seen from him, and nodded encouragingly. Then he pointed at her, raising his eyebrows in question. She understood. He wanted to know her name. She pointed to herself and said clearly, trying to keep her voice from shaking. The warrior repeated it, his pronunciation nearly perfect. Then he said his name again, slower, breaking it into parts so she could learn it. By the fourth repetition she had it. Winter Wolf, that was what his name meant, or close to it. The young warrior who had been kind to her joined them, and Winter Wolf gestured to him while saying another name. The young one grinned and pointed to himself, repeating his own name. It meant something like swift deer, from what Carrie could gather from the gestures he made. It was a small thing, this exchange of names, but it felt significant. She was no longer just a captive, no longer just an anonymous white girl. She was Carrie, and they were Winter Wolf and Swift Deer. They were people with names, not just enemies divided by an unbridgeable gulf. They rode on through the afternoon, and Carrie found herself watching Winter Wolf as he led the group. He rode with unconscious grace, his body moving with the horse, as if they shared one mind. He frequently scanned the horizon, reading the land in ways she could not fathom, occasionally pointing out something to the other warriors that she could not see. Once he held up a hand, and the entire party stopped instantly. They waited in silence for several minutes while he watched something in the distance. Finally, he relaxed and signaled them forward. Carrie never did see what had concerned him, but she understood that his vigilance was what kept them safe. He was responsible for these men, and now apparently for her as well, and he took that responsibility seriously. As the sun began to descend again, Carrie could see smoke rising in the distance. Many fires, too many to be just a small camp. Her heart began to beat faster as she realized they were approaching the main Comanche village. This was the moment she had been dreading, when her fate would truly be decided. Would she be killed, enslaved, tortured as the stories claimed? Winter Wolf must have sensed her fear because he dropped back to ride beside her. He said something in his language, his tone reassuring, and made a gesture that seemed to mean she should not be afraid. But how could she not be afraid? She was riding into a Comanche village as a captive, a white girl whose people had been at war with these people for decades. The village appeared over a rise, a sprawling collection of tipis arranged in rough circles near a river. There must have been 60 or 70 lodges, maybe more, with horses grazing nearby and smoke rising from cooking fires. Children played in the spaces between lodges, their laughter carrying on the wind. Women worked at various tasks, scraping hides, tending fires, weaving. Men sat in groups, talking or working on weapons and tools. It looked almost peaceful, almost normal, so different from what she had imagined. As their party approached, people began to notice them. Children stopped playing and stared. Women paused in their work. Men stood and gathered, watching with interest. Word spread quickly, and soon a crowd had formed to greet the returning warriors. Winter Wolf led them into the center of the village, and Carrie felt hundreds of eyes on her. Some faces showed curiosity, others suspicion or hostility. A few showed what might have been pity. She kept her head up despite her fear, refusing to show weakness, even though inside she was terrified. Winter Wolf dismounted and helped her down, keeping a hand on her arm as if to steady her, or perhaps to show the gathered crowd that she was under his protection. He spoke to the crowd in a loud, clear voice, explaining something. Carrie caught her own name in the flow of unfamiliar words. The crowd listened, their expressions shifting as he spoke. Some nodded, others murmured among themselves. An older woman pushed through the crowd, her face weathered and wise. She looked at Carrie with sharp eyes that seemed to see everything, then spoke to Winter Wolf in a voice that carried authority. He responded respectfully, gesturing to Carrie's injuries. The old woman nodded and said something that made Winter Wolf relax slightly. The old woman approached Carrie and took her chin in one hand, turning her face to examine the bruise. She clicked her tongue disapprovingly and called out something. A younger woman hurried forward, and the older woman gave her instructions while gesturing to Carrie. Then she looked at Winter Wolf and spoke again, clearly giving him orders. He nodded and turned to Carrie. He gestured for her to follow the younger woman, his expression encouraging. Carrie hesitated, looking at the sea of unfamiliar faces, but what choice did she have? She followed the young woman through the crowd, feeling their eyes on her back, walking into an uncertain future that terrified her more than she could express. But as she walked, she heard Winter Wolf's voice behind her speaking to the crowd, and though she did not understand the words, something in his tone sounded protective. Perhaps, she thought, perhaps she would survive this after all. The young woman led Carrie to a tipi on the eastern edge of the village circle, one that was well maintained with colourful designs painted on its hide covering. Geometric patterns in red and yellow spiraled around the base, and symbols Carrie did not recognize marked the entrance flap. The woman pulled aside the heavy leather door and gestured for Carrie to enter. Inside, the space was surprisingly spacious and organized, with sleeping robes arranged neatly along the curved walls. Parfleches decorated with intricate beadwork, stacked carefully, and a small fire pit in the center with a smoke hole above that let in a shaft of afternoon light. The air smelled of sage and tanned leather and wood smoke. The young woman pointed to herself and said her name slowly, repeating it twice. It sounded like morning rain to Carrie's untrained ear. She was perhaps 25, with kind eyes and quick movements, her hair in 2 long braids wrapped with strips of red cloth. Morning Rain gestured for Carrie to sit on one of the buffalo robes while she gathered items from around the tipi. She brought out a clay bowl and poured water into it from a skin bag, then produced small pouches of what looked like dried herbs and roots. She began mixing a paste, her movements practiced and confident. The older woman from the crowd entered the tipi then, ducking through the low entrance with surprising agility for her age. She carried a bundle wrapped in soft doeskin, which she set down carefully before settling herself across from Carrie. She studied Carrie's face again, her eyes sharp and assessing, then spoke to Morning Rain in their flowing language. Morning Rain nodded and brought the bowl of paste to the older woman. The old woman dipped her fingers in the mixture and began applying it to Carrie's bruised face with surprising gentleness. The paste was cool and soothing, easing some of the hot throbbing pain. Carrie flinched at first from the touch, her body still expecting violence, but the woman made soft, clucking sounds like one might make to calm a frightened horse. She worked carefully, treating not just the bruise on Carrie's face, but also examining the rope burns on her wrists. She clicked her tongue in disapproval at the damage, speaking to Morning Rain, who hurried to bring more supplies. They cleaned the wounds with warm water, applied more of the herbal paste, and then wrapped Carrie's wrists in strips of soft leather to protect the raw skin. The care they took surprised Carrie. These were not the actions of people who meant her immediate harm. The older woman unwrapped the doeskin bundle she had brought, revealing a dress made of soft deerskin, beautifully worked with beads and quill work along the yoke and sleeves. It was clearly precious, something that had taken months or even years to create. She held it up to Carrie, measuring it with her eyes, then nodded in satisfaction. She spoke to Carrie directly, her tone firm but not unkind, gesturing to Carrie's torn and filthy calico dress. The meaning was clear. Carrie needed to change into proper clothing. Morning Rain stood and positioned herself between Carrie and the entrance, providing privacy and perhaps preventing escape. Carrie looked at the beautiful deerskin dress, then at her own ruined garment, stained with blood and dirt and torn beyond repair. It felt like surrendering something to take off her own dress, like letting go of the last piece of her former life. But that life was already gone, burned and buried in a single morning. With trembling hands, Carrie removed her torn dress, feeling vulnerable and exposed, despite Morning Rain's discreet positioning. The old woman helped her into the deerskin dress, guiding her arms through the sleeves, settling the soft leather over her shoulders. It fit remarkably well, falling to mid-calf, the leather supple and comfortable against her skin. It was warmer than her cotton dress had been, more practical for this land. The old woman circled her, adjusting the fit, nodding with approval. She said something that made Morning Rain smile, then patted Carrie's shoulder before gathering up the torn calico dress. She examined it briefly, then tossed it into the fire pit, where it began to smolder and burn. Carrie watched her old dress turn to ash, feeling as if part of her identity was burning with it. She was no longer the settler girl Caroline Wells in her mother's hand-sewn dress. She was something else now, something undefined and uncertain. Morning Rain brought her moccasins next, soft leather worked with beads in a flower pattern. They fit well enough, far more comfortable than the hard leather boots she had been wearing. The old woman stood back and looked at Carrie with something that might have been satisfaction, speaking to Morning Rain, who nodded enthusiastically. Then the old woman did something unexpected. She reached out and gently touched Carrie's face, not examining her injuries this time, but in a gesture that felt almost maternal. She spoke softly, just a few words, then turned and left the teepee with her bundle of medicines. Carrie looked at Morning Rain, confused by the gesture. Morning Rain smiled and tried to explain with gestures and simple words, pointing to the old woman's departing figure, then to herself, then to Carrie, making a circling motion that seemed to indicate inclusion or belonging. Carrie was not sure she understood, but the kindness was unmistakable. That evening, as the sun set and cooking fires were lit throughout the village, Morning Rain brought food. Not just the dried meat and pemmican Carrie had eaten on the trail, but a proper meal. There was stew made with meat and wild onions and some kind of root vegetable, served in a wooden bowl with a horn spoon. There were cakes made from ground seeds and berries preserved in fat. It was simple food, but prepared with care, and Carrie realized she had not eaten a real meal since breakfast with her family, what felt like a lifetime ago. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, feeling strength return to her body. Morning Rain sat across from her, eating her own meal, occasionally smiling at Carrie in encouragement. After they finished eating, Morning Rain tried to teach Carrie words in the Comanche language. She would point to objects and say their names clearly: fire, water, bowl, sky. Carrie repeated them, stumbling over the unfamiliar sounds. But Morning Rain was patient, repeating words as many times as needed. As darkness fell completely, the sounds of the village changed. The working sounds of day gave way to evening sounds. Drums began to beat somewhere in the village center, accompanied by singing. Children were called into their lodges. Horses nickered softly from where they were tethered. Morning Rain gestured for Carrie to follow her outside. Carrie hesitated, afraid of facing the stairs again, but Morning Rain took her hand with gentle insistence. They stepped out into the cool night air, and Morning Rain led her toward the center of the village, where a large fire burned. People had gathered in a circle around the fire, and the warriors who had rescued Carrie from the outlaws were there, Winter Wolf among them. He'd cleaned off all the war paint and changed into different clothing, leggings and a shirt, decorated with intricate beadwork. His long hair was loose now, falling past his shoulders, with a single eagle feather tied into it. When Winter Wolf saw Carrie approaching with Morning Rain, something shifted in his expression. His eyes widened slightly, and he stood up from where he had been sitting with the other warriors. He said something to Morning Rain, who responded with a smile and a few words. Winter Wolf approached Carrie, looking at her in the deerskin dress, and spoke. His tone was warm, approving. He gestured to a place near the fire where buffalo robes had been laid out, indicating she should sit. Carrie sat down carefully, very aware of all the eyes on her. The old woman who had treated her injuries was there too, sitting in a place of obvious honor. She caught Carrie's eye and nodded, a small gesture of acknowledgement. Winter Wolf sat down nearby, not right next to her, but close enough that his presence felt protective. The drumming grew more rhythmic, more intense, and several warriors stood to dance. It was not like any dancing Carrie had seen in settlements, no formal steps or partner movements. This was something primal and powerful, bodies moving to the beat of the drums, feet stamping the earth, voices calling out in rhythm. The dancers moved around the fire, their shadows huge and flickering against the surrounding teepees. Some of the dances seemed to tell stories, warriors acting out hunts or battles with dramatic gestures. The crowd watched with rapt attention, occasionally calling out encouragement or approval. Children watched wide-eyed from their mothers' laps. Elders nodded along to the familiar rhythms. It was a community gathered together, sharing stories and traditions, maintaining bonds that held them together in this harsh land. At one point, Winterwolf stood and joined the dancing. His movements were powerful and controlled, his body telling a story Carrie could not fully understand, but could feel nonetheless. There was triumph in his movements and pride, but also something that looked like sorrow or loss. When he finished and returned to his seat, slightly breathless, several people called out to him with what sounded like praise or thanks. The old woman spoke to him, her voice carrying authority, and he nodded respectfully. Then she turned and spoke to the gathered crowd, her voice rising to carry to all assembled. Carrie heard her own name mentioned, and Winterwolf's name, and something about the outlaws. The crowd listened intently, and when the old woman finished, many nodded in agreement. Whatever she had said, it seemed important. Morning Rain leaned close to Carrie and tried to explain with gestures and the few words Carrie had learned. She pointed to Winterwolf, made a gesture of protection, pointed to Carrie, then made a circling motion around them both. Carrie thought she understood. Winterwolf had claimed responsibility for her, and the old woman, who Morning Rain indicated was the chief's mother, or perhaps a medicine woman of great importance, had approved this arrangement. Carrie was under Winterwolf's protection, which meant something significant in their culture. It meant she would not be harmed, at least not without consequences. It was not freedom, not by any means, but it was better than many fates she might have suffered. The gathering continued late into the night, but eventually people began to drift back to their own lodges. Families with young children left first, then gradually others, until only a few men remained by the fire, talking in low voices and passing a pipe between them. Morning Rain stood and gestured for Carrie to follow her back to the teepee. Winterwolf caught Carrie's eye as she stood, and he said something in his language. His tone was gentle, and though she did not understand the words, she thought he might be saying something like, "Good night" or "Rest well." She nodded to him, not trusting her voice, and followed Morning Rain back through the quiet village. Inside the teepee, Morning Rain had prepared a comfortable sleeping place for Carrie, with soft buffalo robes and a blanket. She pointed to it, then to another sleeping area on the opposite side of the teepee that was clearly her own. Then she did something that touched Carrie deeply. She pulled out a small carved wooden bird from her belongings and offered it to Carrie. It was beautifully made, smooth from handling, clearly precious to Morning Rain. Carrie tried to refuse, shaking her head, but Morning Rain pressed it into her hands with an insistent smile. It was a gift, a gesture of friendship or welcome. Carrie held the small bird carefully, feeling tears prick her eyes at this unexpected kindness. She managed to say thank you in English, though she knew Morning Rain might not understand the words. But Morning Rain smiled as if she understood the sentiment perfectly. Carrie lay down on the soft robes, the small wooden bird clutched in her hand. Morning Rain banked the fire for the night, leaving just enough coals to keep a little warmth in the teepee. Then she settled into her own sleeping robes. Within minutes, her breathing became deep and regular with sleep. Carrie lay awake for a long time, staring up at the smoke hole where she could see a small patch of star-filled sky. Her mind was reeling with everything that had happened. Just 2 days ago, she had been living a simple life on a homestead with her family, worried about ordinary things, like whether the garden would produce enough vegetables and whether they had enough firewood stacked for winter. Now her family was dead, her home destroyed, and she was lying in a Comanche teepee wearing deerskin and trying to process the impossible turns her life had taken. She thought about Winterwolf, trying to understand him. He was clearly a warrior of some importance, respected by his people. He had killed the outlaws without hesitation, with brutal efficiency. Yet he had also shown her mercy when he had no reason to. He had made sure she had water and food on the trail. He had brought her to his village instead of leaving her to die in the wilderness. He had placed her under his protection. Why? What did he see when he looked at her? Just a pathetic white girl to be pitied? A captive to be used as his people saw fit? Or something else, something she could not yet understand? She thought too about the women who had cared for her today, the old woman with the medicine and the beautiful dress, Morning Rain with her patient language lessons and her gift of the wooden bird. They had no reason to be kind to her. Her people and their people were enemies, had been enemies for years. Settlers pushed into Comanche land, and the Comanche fought back to protect their way of life. There had been violence on both sides, atrocities committed by both whites and Comanche. Carrie had heard the stories growing up, tales meant to frighten children into obedience and adults into vigilance. But the people she had met today did not match those stories. They were complex, capable of both violence and tenderness, just like any people. Sleep finally claimed her in the early hours of morning, a deep, exhausted sleep free of dreams. When she woke, sunlight was streaming through the smoke hole, and morning rain was already up, preparing a morning meal of some kind of porridge made from ground seeds and dried berries. She smiled when she saw Carrie wake and said something in greeting. Carrie sat up slowly, her body still aching but less severely than the day before. The herbal paste and a night of rest had helped. Morning rain brought her a bowl of the porridge and more water. They ate together in companionable silence, and Carrie found herself feeling something she had not expected. Not happiness, certainly, not with the grief still raw in her heart, but perhaps a tentative sense of safety, a feeling that maybe she would survive whatever came next. After they ate, morning rain indicated that Carrie should come with her. They left the teepee and walked through the village, which was fully awake now and busy with morning activities. Women were tending fires, preparing food, working on hides stretched on frames. Men checked weapons and tools or tended to horses. Children played games between the lodges, their laughter bright in the morning air. A few people stared at Carrie as she passed, but most simply nodded or ignored her, going about their daily tasks. Morning rain led her to the river that ran near the village, where several women were already gathered, some washing clothes, others filling water containers. Morning rain gestured to the water and made washing motions, indicating that Carrie could bathe if she wished. The other women looked up as they approached, their conversations pausing. Morning rain spoke to them, presumably explaining who Carrie was, or why she was there. Some of the women nodded in understanding, others looked skeptical or unfriendly, but none were openly hostile. Morning rain led Carrie to a more secluded spot upstream, where trees provided some privacy. She handed Carrie a small pouch containing what looked like crushed yucca root for soap and indicated she would stand guard. Carrie understood the gift of privacy and was grateful for it. She stripped off the deerskin dress carefully, folding it and placing it on a rock with her new moccasins. Then she waded into the cold river water, gasping at the temperature but forcing herself to continue. The water was achingly cold, but clean and clear, running swift over smooth stones. Carrie used the yucca root soap to wash away days of dirt and blood and sweat. She scrubbed her skin until it was pink and clean, washed her hair until it felt free of the dust and grime. The cold water shocked her fully awake, made her feel more alive than she had in days. She stayed in only long enough to get clean, not wanting to abuse morning rain's kindness or the privacy she was providing. When she emerged, shivering, morning rain had a blanket ready to wrap around her. She had also laid out the deerskin dress in the sun to warm it. Carrie dried off as best she could and dressed again, her wet hair dripping down her back. As they walked back to the teepee, Carrie saw Winterwolf across the village, working with a group of young men and their horses. He was clearly teaching them something, demonstrating movements and techniques, while the young men watched intently and tried to imitate him. He rode bareback with such skill that horse and rider seemed to be one creature, wheeling and turning at speeds that should have been impossible. One of the young men attempted the same maneuver and nearly fell off, causing the others to laugh good-naturedly. Winterwolf grinned and said something that made them all laugh harder, then dismounted in one fluid motion to help the fallen student back to his feet. He glanced up and saw Carrie watching from across the village. Their eyes met for a moment, and something passed between them again, that wordless communication that transcended language. He said something to his students, then began walking toward her with purposeful strides. Morning Rain said something to Carrie that sounded like reassurance, then discreetly moved a few steps away to give them space to talk, though of course they could not truly talk without shared language. Winterwolf stopped a respectful distance from Carrie and spoke, his tone questioning. He gestured to her dress, to her cleaned appearance, seemed to be asking if she was well, if she had what she needed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Carrie nodded, not sure what else to do. She tried to think of something to say in his language, searching her memory for the words morning rain had taught her the night before. Finally, she managed to say what she thought was thank you, though she mangled the pronunciation badly. Winterwolf's face broke into a genuine smile, the first real smile she had seen from him. It transformed his features, made him look younger and less severe. He repeated the phrase correctly, breaking it down slowly so she could learn the proper pronunciation. She tried again, doing better this time. He nodded encouragingly and said something else, pointing to himself, then to her, then making a gesture that seemed to indicate he would check on her later. Then he returned to his students, who had been watching the interaction with obvious curiosity. Days turned into weeks, and Carrie found herself falling into the rhythms of Comanche life with a naturalness that would have shocked her former self. Morning Rain proved to be a patient and dedicated teacher, spending hours each day helping Carrie learn the language and customs of the people. The words came slowly at first, each one a struggle to pronounce correctly, but gradually Carrie's tongue adapted to the new sounds and patterns. She learned the words for everyday objects and actions, then simple phrases, then more complex ideas. Morning Rain would point to things around the village and in nature, naming them over and over until Carrie could repeat them without hesitation. Sky, cloud, horse, water, fire, woman, man, child. The building blocks of communication. But language was only part of what Carrie needed to learn. Morning Rain also taught her the skills necessary for survival in this life. How to properly tan a hide by scraping away every bit of flesh and membrane, then working the skin with a mixture of brains and liver until it became supple and soft. How to prepare pemmican by pounding dried meat into powder, mixing it with rendered fat and berries, packing it into rawhide containers where it would keep for months or even years. How to identify edible plants and roots in the prairie, which ones were nourishing and which ones would make you sick or kill you. How to repair moccasins when they wore through, stitching new soles with sinew and an awl made from bone. Morning Rain demonstrated each task with infinite patience, then guided Carrie's hands through the motions until they became familiar. The work was hard, much harder than the chores Carrie had done on the homestead. Her hands became rough and calloused. Her back ached from bending over hides stretched on frames. Her knees hurt from kneeling to grind seeds on stone metates. But there was also a satisfaction in the work, in learning skills that had been perfected over generations, in seeing the tangible results of her labor. When she successfully tanned her first small hide without Morning Rain's help, producing leather that was soft and evenly worked, Morning Rain had clapped her hands in delight and immediately taken Carrie to show the old medicine woman. The old woman, whose name Carrie had learned was Stands in Storm, had examined the hide critically, then nodded her approval. That small gesture of recognition had filled Carrie with an unexpected pride. Winterwolf remained a constant but somewhat distant presence in her new life. He would check on her regularly, appearing at Morning Rain's teepee to ask in their language how she was adapting, if she needed anything, whether anyone in the village was treating her poorly. His concern seemed genuine, not the possessive attention of an owner toward property, but something more complex. Carrie found herself watching for him throughout the day, noticing when he rode out with hunting parties and feeling relieved when he returned safely. He was often busy with his responsibilities as a war leader and hunter, but he always made time to stop by, even if just for a brief conversation. As Carrie's grasp of the language improved, their exchanges became longer and more substantive. One evening, about 3 weeks after her arrival, Winterwolf came to the teepee carrying something wrapped in soft leather. Morning Rain saw him approach and, with a knowing smile that Carrie was beginning to recognize, announced that she needed to visit her sister's lodge and would be gone for some time. She left before Carrie could protest, leaving her alone with Winter Wolf. He entered the teepee at Carrie's nervous invitation and sat across the fire from her, his movements relaxed and unhurried. He unwrapped the leather bundle to reveal a pair of moccasins, clearly new, decorated with intricate beadwork in a pattern of blue and white flowers. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, each tiny bead perfectly placed, the stitching invisible and strong. He offered them to Carrie without ceremony, simply extending his hands. Carrie took the moccasins carefully, admiring the detailed work. She knew enough now to understand that such fine beadwork represented many hours of painstaking labor. She looked up at Winter Wolf with questions in her eyes, and he explained in the simple language she could understand that his sister had made them. He had asked her to make something special for the white woman under his protection, and his sister had created these. Carrie turned the moccasins over in her hands, touched by the gesture and by the fact that his family was accepting her presence. She tried the moccasins on, and they fit perfectly comfortable and beautiful. She thanked him in Comanche, her pronunciation much improved from those first attempts, and he smiled that transformative smile that made his severe features warm and approachable. Chuck, they talked as the fire burned low, or rather Winter Wolf talked and Carrie listened, straining to understand every word. He told her about his family, about his father who had been killed in a raid against the Texans 5 years ago, about his mother who had died of the white man's spotted sickness when he was young, about his 2 sisters who were both married to respected warriors in the tribe. He spoke of his childhood, of learning to ride before he could walk properly, of his first successful hunt when he was only 10 and had brought down a young buffalo cow with a well-placed arrow. He described the old ways that were disappearing as more and more white settlers pushed into their lands, driving away the buffalo herds, bringing disease and war. His voice held sadness when he spoke of these changes, a grief for a way of life that was dying. Carrie found herself sharing her own story, though it pained her to speak of it. She told him about her family, about her father's dreams of building something lasting in this new land, about her mother's gentle faith and her brother's bright curiosity. She described the morning the outlaws came, her voice breaking as she recounted watching her family fall. Winter Wolf listened with complete attention, his dark eyes never leaving her face. When her voice failed entirely and tears began to fall, he did not look away or dismiss her grief. He simply moved closer and placed his hand over hers, a gesture of comfort and shared sorrow. They sat like that in silence for a long time, 2 people from different worlds, united by their understanding of loss. When he finally left that night, something had shifted between them. They were no longer just warrior and captive, protector and protected. They were 2 people who had begun to see each other as human beings with histories and hurts and hopes. Carrie lay awake long after he departed, thinking about the gentleness in his touch, the kindness in his eyes, the way he had listened to her story as if it mattered. She was confused by her own feelings, by the way her heart had lifted when he smiled, by the fact that she had felt safer in his presence than she had in weeks. This was not supposed to happen. He was Comanche, one of the people her own people feared and fought against. She should not be developing feelings for him, should not be looking forward to his visits, should not be finding comfort in his company. The autumn deepened into early winter, and the village prepared for the cold months ahead. Hunting parties went out frequently, bringing back deer and buffalo and elk to be processed and stored. The women worked tirelessly, cutting meat into strips for drying, rendering fat, scraping and tanning hides that would be used for winter robes and teepee covers. Carrie worked alongside Morning Rain and the other women, her skills improving with practice. Some of the women had warmed to her, teaching her their songs as they worked, laughing at her mistakes, but not unkindly. Others remained cold and distant, making it clear they did not trust or welcome a white woman in their midst. Carrie could not blame them for their suspicion. She knew that white soldiers and settlers had committed terrible acts against the Comanche, burning villages, killing women and children, breaking treaties. Her presence was a reminder of those conflicts. One morning, Carrie woke to find the ground covered in the first light snow of winter. The village looked transformed, the familiar teepees and paths softened by the white blanket. Children ran out immediately to play in the snow, throwing handfuls at each other and laughing. Morning rain led Carrie outside to help gather extra firewood before the snow got too deep. As they worked, Carrie noticed unusual activity in the village. Warriors were gathering near the center, checking weapons, preparing horses. Something was happening. Morning Rain explained that scouts had reported a large buffalo herd moving south ahead of the winter storms. This was likely the last good hunting opportunity before the deep cold set in, and every able warrior would ride out. It was dangerous to hunt in such conditions, but necessary. The meat from this hunt would mean the difference between a winter of plenty and a winter of hunger. Carrie watched as the hunting party assembled. Winter Wolf was there, of course, checking his bow and arrows, speaking with other warriors about strategy. His paint horse stamped impatiently, sensing the excitement. The hunters painted their faces and arms with symbols meant to bring luck and skill. Women sang hunting songs, their voices rising in the cold morning air. Children watched wide-eyed, the older boys clearly wishing they were old enough to join. Stands in Storm appeared, carrying a bundle of sacred objects, and she walked among the warriors, touching each one and speaking blessings over them. When she reached Winter Wolf, she spoke longer, her weathered hand resting on his shoulder. He bowed his head respectfully, listening to whatever wisdom she was imparting. Before mounting his horse, Winter Wolf looked across the crowd and found Carrie's eyes. He said something to the warrior next to him, then walked over to where she stood with Morning Rain. He spoke to her in a low voice, telling her they would return in 3 or 4 days if the hunt went well, longer if they had to track the herd further. He asked if she would be all right in his absence, and she nodded, managing a small smile despite the worry that had suddenly bloomed in her chest. The thought of him riding into danger made her anxious in a way she did not fully understand or want to examine too closely. He seemed to sense her concern because he reached out and briefly touched her face, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. It was a familiar gesture, one that suggested affection beyond mere duty. Then he was gone, mounting his horse in one fluid motion, and the hunting party rode out of the village in a thunder of hooves. The village felt strangely empty with so many warriors gone. The remaining men were the very old, the very young, or those recovering from injuries. The women took on additional security responsibilities, always keeping watch on the perimeter, making sure the horse herd was guarded. That first night, Carrie could not sleep. She lay in her robes listening to the wind howl around the teepee, imagining all the things that could go wrong on a winter hunt. Buffalo were dangerous animals, massive and unpredictable. A hunter could be gored or trampled, horses could slip on ice, men could be separated from the group in a storm and freeze to death. She told herself she was being foolish, that Winter Wolf had survived countless hunts before this one, but the worry would not leave her. The next day brought more snow, heavy and steady. The village hunkered down, everyone staying close to their fires. Morning Rain tried to distract Carrie with more language lessons and stories, tales of the tribe's history and heroes, but Carrie's attention kept drifting. On the third day, AEI, Scout rode in with news that the hunting party had found the herd and made a successful kill. They were processing the meat and would return the following day. The relief Carrie felt at this news was overwhelming, and she finally admitted to herself what she had been trying to deny. She cared for Winter Wolf deeply and dangerously. Somewhere in these weeks of captivity that no longer felt like captivity, she had developed feelings for the warrior who had saved her life. It was impossible and foolish and complicated beyond measure, but it was true. The hunting party returned. Late the next afternoon, their horses loaded with meat and hides. The entire village turned out to greet them, celebrating the successful hunt. The men were exhausted but triumphant, already telling stories of the hunt, of particularly difficult kills, of close calls and impressive shots. Winter Wolf rode in, near the front of the group, and Carrie's heart lifted at the sight of him safe and whole. He was covered in blood from the butchering work, his face tired but satisfied. He saw her in the crowd, and his expression brightened. As soon as he had seen to his horse and delivered his portion of the kill to be distributed, he came to find... He looked at her for a long moment, something intense and searching in his gaze, then spoke. He told her he had thought of her during the hunt, had wanted to return safely because of her. The admission was direct and honest, leaving no room for misunderstanding. Carrie felt her breath catch in her chest. She should step back, should maintain distance, should remember that this situation was temporary and impossible. But instead, she found herself moving closer to him, her hand reaching out to touch his arm. She told him in careful Comanche that she had worried for his safety, that she had been glad to see him return. It was as close as she dared come to, expressing the feelings that confused and frightened her. Winter Wolf's hand covered hers, where it rested on his arm. He said her name, his pronunciation of Caroline now perfect after weeks of practice. Then he said something longer, more complex, speaking slowly so she could follow. He told her that when he had first seen her tied up by the outlaws, something in his chest had tightened. He had felt compelled to save her, not just from duty, but from something deeper. In the weeks since, watching her adapt to their ways, seeing her strength and resilience, learning her mind and heart through their conversations, his feelings had grown. He knew the situation was complicated, knew that her people and his people were enemies, knew that she had been brought here against her will. But he also knew that his heart had chosen her, and among his people, the heart's choice was honored. Above all, Carrie stood frozen, trying to process what he was telling her. This proud warrior, this man who was respected and admired by his entire tribe, was declaring feelings for her, a white captive with nothing to offer. It seemed impossible. Yet when she looked into his eyes, she saw only sincerity and vulnerability. He was opening his heart to her, risking rejection, offering something precious. She thought of her family, of the life she had lost, of everything that stood between them. She thought of the hatred and violence that divided their peoples. But she also thought of his gentleness, his kindness, the way he had protected her from the first moment. She thought of the safety she felt in his presence, the way her heart responded to his smile, the connection that had grown between them. Despite every obstacle, she made her decision in that moment, one that would change everything. She stepped closer to him, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. In careful Comanche, choosing her words with precision, she told him that her heart had also made a choice. That despite everything, despite the impossibility of it all, she had developed feelings for him that she could no longer deny. That when he had been gone on the hunt, she had felt his absence like a physical pain, that she did not know what the future held, but she knew that in this moment, standing here with him, she felt something true and real. Winter Wolf's face transformed with joy. He reached up and cupped her face in both hands, his touch gentle despite his strength. He said something in Comanche that she did not fully understand, the words too quick and too emotional, but the meaning was clear in his eyes. Then, with slow deliberation, giving her time to pull away if she wished, he leaned down and kissed her. It was a soft kiss, tentative and sweet, a question and an answer all at once. Carrie felt the world narrow down to just this moment, this connection, this impossible tenderness between two people who should have been enemies. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling, and Carrie realized with some surprise that she felt happy. genuinely happy for the first time since the morning her family had been killed. Around them, the village continued its celebration of the successful hunt, people too busy with their own joy to notice the quiet moment between Winter Wolf and Carrie. But Morning Rain, watching from the entrance of her teepee, saw and smiled to herself. She had seen this coming for weeks, had watched the connection growing between them, had quietly encouraged it in small ways. Stands in Storm, sitting near the central fire with the other elders, also noticed. Her old eyes missed nothing. She nodded to herself, satisfied. The spirits had their own plans, and sometimes those plans brought together people from different worlds to create something new. That night there was a great feast to celebrate the hunt. Meat roasted over fires, sending delicious smells throughout the village. People ate until they were full, a luxury that would become rarer as winter deepened. There was singing and dancing, stories told and retold. Winter Wolf sat near Carrie throughout the evening, their shoulders touching, their conversations continuing in low voices beneath the larger celebration. He told her about his dreams for the future, about his fears for his people, as the white settlers continued to push into their lands. She told him about her own dreams, the ones she had held before her world shattered, and the new ones beginning to form in this strange new life. As the celebration wound down and people began retiring to their lodges, Winter Wolf walked Carrie back to Morning Rain's teepee. At the entrance, he took her hand and told her that he would speak to the elders soon about making their connection official, about taking her as his wife in the Comanche way. The word wife sent a jolt through Carrie. It was one thing to acknowledge feelings, another entirely to talk of permanent bonds. But when she looked at his hopeful face, she found she could not reject the idea. In fact, somewhere deep inside, she realized it was what she wanted too. This new life, this man, this people who had shown her unexpected kindness. She nodded slowly, and Winter Wolf's smile was brighter than the stars above them. Winter came to the plains with its full fury, bringing winds that howled like wolves and snow that piled high against the teepees. The village settled into the rhythms of the cold season, conserving energy and resources, telling stories around fires, repairing tools and weapons, teaching the young ones the skills and knowledge they would need. Carrie had been with the Comanche for nearly 2 months now, and the girl who had knelt in the dirt begging for death seemed like someone from another lifetime. She had learned not just to survive in this world, but to find purpose and even moments of contentment within it. Her hands were no longer soft, her skin had bronzed from sun and wind, and she could now hold conversations in Comanche without constantly searching for words. Winter Wolf had been true to his word about speaking to the elders. One cold morning, he came to collect Carrie and brought her before the council. A gathering of the tribe's oldest and wisest members, including Stands in Storm. They sat in the largest teepee, a fire burning bright in the center, their weathered faces solemn as they listened to Winter Wolf present his intentions. He spoke with eloquence and passion, explaining how Carrie had come to them, how she had adapted and learned, how she had shown strength and resilience. He spoke of his feelings for her, declaring before all these witnesses that his heart had chosen her and that he wished to take her as his wife according to their customs. His voice was steady and proud, showing no shame or doubt about his choice. The elders listened without interruption, their expressions unreadable. When Winter Wolf finished speaking, Stands in Storm was the first to respond. Her voice carried the weight of years and wisdom as she spoke directly to Carrie, asking questions in their language. She asked why Carrie would choose to stay among people who were not her own, why she would bind herself to a man whose people were at war with hers. She asked if Carrie understood what it meant to become Comanche, that it would require leaving behind her old identity entirely, that there would be no going back to the white world. She asked if Carrie was prepared to bear the consequences of such a choice, knowing that both white settlers and some Comanche might condemn her for it. Carrie answered as honestly as she could, her voice shaking slightly, but growing stronger as she spoke. She told them that her old life had been destroyed, that everyone she had loved was dead, that the white world held nothing for her now but painful memories. She explained that in the weeks she had been here, people had shown her kindness when they had no obligation to do so. Morning Rain had become like a sister to her. Stands in Storm herself had tended her wounds with gentle hands. Winter Wolf had protected her and seen her not as property but as a person worthy of respect. She admitted she did not fully understand all their ways yet, but she was willing to learn. She said that Winter Wolf had saved her life and then given her a reason to value that life again. If his heart had chosen hers, then her heart had answered, and she would be honored to become his wife and join his people. The elders conferred among themselves in low voices, while Carrie and Winter Wolf waited in tense silence. The discussion seemed to go on forever. Various elders raising points and concerns, others responding with arguments of their own. Finally, Stands in Storm raised her hand and silence fell. She looked at Carrie with those sharp eyes that seemed to see into the soul. Then at Winter Wolf, then back to Carrie. She spoke, and though her words were formal and ritualistic, there was warmth beneath them. She said that the spirits worked in mysterious ways, bringing together those who were meant to walk the same path. She acknowledged that this was an unusual situation, but said that Winter Wolf was a respected warrior who had proven his judgment many times, and if he believed Carrie was worthy to join their people, then the council would not stand in his way. However, she added firmly, there would be a trial period. Carrie must prove herself capable of fully embracing the Comanche way of life. She must learn their customs thoroughly, contribute meaningfully to the tribe, and show absolute loyalty to the people. Only after she had demonstrated these things convincingly would the formal marriage ceremony take place. Winter Wolf accepted these terms immediately, bowing his head in gratitude to the elders. Carrie did the same, understanding that she had been given a tremendous gift. These people were willing to accept her, a former enemy, into their midst. They were offering her a place to belong when she had thought herself forever alone. The council blessed them both, and Stands in Storm performed a small ceremony right there, binding their hands together with a strip of soft leather and speaking words of protection and guidance over them. It was not yet a marriage, but it was a promise, a commitment recognized by the tribe. When they left the council tipi, hand in hand, Carrie felt tears on her cheeks, but they were not tears of sorrow. The news spread quickly through the village, and reactions were mixed. Many people were supportive, coming to offer congratulations and small gifts. Morning Rain was overjoyed, immediately declaring that she would help Carrie prepare for the eventual wedding ceremony and teach her everything she needed to know about being a Comanche wife. Winter Wolf's sisters visited, both women examining Carrie with curious but not unfriendly eyes, asking her questions about her skills and her intentions toward their brother. They seemed satisfied with her answers and welcomed her tentatively into the family. But there were also those who disapproved. An older warrior named Broken Lance made his displeasure known, arguing loudly that bringing a white woman into the tribe was dangerous, that she could be a spy for the settlers, that mixing their blood with the enemy's blood was a betrayal of their ancestors. Several others echoed his concerns, though most kept their objections private. Winter Wolf did not let the opposition disturb him. He moved Carrie from Morning Rain's teepee to his own, a larger dwelling on the western edge of the village circle. It was well maintained and comfortable, decorated with his own weapons and trophies from successful hunts. He had arranged one side for Carrie, giving her space that was her own, respecting the fact that they were not yet fully married in the eyes of the tribe. Morning Rain helped Carrie move her few possessions, which now included several gifts from tribe members who had warmed to her. The wooden bird Morning Rain had given her, the beautiful moccasins from Winter Wolf's sister, a bone comb from Stands in Storm, a warm winter robe from an elder woman who had smiled at Carrie's attempts to tan hides. These objects represented her new life, her new connections. Living with Winter Wolf deepened their bond in ways Carrie had not anticipated. They fell into comfortable routines, sharing meals and conversation, working on tasks together, learning the small details of each other's habits and preferences. Winter Wolf was patient with her continuing language mistakes and cultural missteps, gently correcting her and explaining the reasons behind various customs. He taught her how to make arrows, showing her how to select the straightest shafts, how to attach the stone points securely, how to add feathers for proper flight. She taught him some English words, though he was less interested in learning her language than she had been in learning his. He said the future belonged to the Comanche way, and English would not help his people survive. As winter deepened, the village faced challenges. Food supplies ran lower than expected when a late storm killed several horses and made hunting nearly impossible for 2 weeks. Carrie worked alongside the other women to make the reduced rations stretch, learning how to make nourishing soup from bones and scraps that seemed to have no value. She noticed that Winter Wolf often gave her portions of his own food, claiming he was not hungry, though she knew he was sacrificing to ensure she had enough. She tried to refuse, but he was insistent. He told her she was still recovering from her ordeal, still building strength, and needed the food more than he did. His care for her welfare touched her deeply. One particularly brutal night, when the wind screamed outside and the cold seeped through every gap in the tipi walls, Carrie woke to find herself shivering uncontrollably despite her buffalo robes. Winter Wolf heard her from his side of the teepee and came over, wrapping additional blankets around her and building up the fire. But the cold would not release its grip on her, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely speak. Without hesitation, Winter Wolf lay down beside her, pulling her close to share his body heat. She tensed initially, uncertain, but he spoke softly, reassuring her, explaining that in winter it was common for people to sleep close together for warmth and survival. Gradually she relaxed against him, his warmth seeping into her frozen limbs, and she finally stopped shivering. They lay like that for the rest of the night, and Carrie felt safer and more at peace than she had in months. As the days passed, physical affection became more natural between them. Her touch on the shoulder while passing, hands held while walking through the village, sitting close by the fire in the evenings. Winter Wolf was always respectful of boundaries, never pushing for more than Carrie was ready to give, but she found herself wanting to be closer to him, to explore these new feelings fully. One evening, as they sat together working on separate projects, she set down her beadwork and asked him to tell her about Comanche marriage customs, what would be expected of her as his wife. He explained the ceremony, the exchange of gifts, the responsibilities of a wife and husband to each other and to the tribe. He told her that marriage among his people was a partnership, that women were valued for their contributions and had voices in family decisions. He spoke of children with a wistfulness that made her realize how much he wanted a family. The thought of bearing children had not fully occurred to Carrie before that moment. In her old life, she had assumed she would eventually marry and have babies, but that future had seemed distant and abstract. Now it was immediate and real. Could she imagine having Winter Wolf's children, raising them in this world, teaching them the Comanche ways? Looking at his hopeful face in the firelight, she found that yes, she could imagine it, and the image did not frighten her as much as it perhaps should have. She was only 19, young enough to build an entirely new life, to become someone different from the girl she had been. She told him she wanted children someday when the time was right, and the joy in his eyes was unmistakable. Spring came late that year, but when it finally arrived, it transformed the world. The snow melted into rushing streams, grass pushed up through the mud, wildflowers bloomed in impossible profusion across the prairie. The village came back to life after the long winter, people emerging from their teepees to work in the sunshine, children running wild with pent-up energy. Hunting parties went out again, returning with fresh meat. The women planted small gardens of corn and squash in the river bottom. There was a sense of renewal, of surviving another hard season, of hope for the months ahead. Carrie had now been with the tribe for nearly 6 months, and she had proven herself repeatedly. She worked as hard as any woman in the village, had learned the language fluently, contributed to the community welfare without complaint, and showed unwavering loyalty to the people who had become her people. Stands in Storm called Carrie to her teepee one warm spring morning. The old woman gestured for her to sit and poured her tea made from herbs, studying her with those penetrating eyes. She asked Carrie direct questions about her commitment to Winterwolf and to the tribe, testing the sincerity of her answers. She asked if Carrie understood that becoming fully Comanche meant she could never return to the white world, that she would be considered a traitor by her own kind. She asked if Carrie was prepared to defend the tribe against white settlers if necessary, even though those settlers might include people she had once known. These were hard questions with harder implications, but Carrie answered honestly. She said her old life was dead and buried with her family. She had found a new life here, new family, new purpose. The people who had killed her parents were white men after all. She owed nothing to the white world. Her loyalty was here now, with Winterwolf and the tribe who had given her a home when she had nothing. Stands in Storm nodded slowly, seeming satisfied with these answers. She told Carrie that the trial period had been sufficient, that she had proven herself worthy, and that the marriage ceremony would take place during the next full moon, just 10 days away. Carrie felt her heart leap with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. This was really happening. She was going to marry Winterwolf, bind her life to his completely, become fully Comanche in the eyes of the tribe and the spirits. Stands in Storm gave her instructions on what to prepare, what to learn, what rituals to understand before the ceremony. She also gave Carrie a gift, a necklace made of bone and turquoise that had belonged to her own grandmother. She said it would bring blessings of fertility and long life to Carrie's marriage. Carrie accepted the precious gift with trembling hands, overcome by the significance of it. The next 10 days passed in a blur of preparation. Morning Rain and Winterwolf's sisters helped Carrie create a wedding dress, the most beautiful garment she had ever owned. It was made of the softest white deerskin, covered in intricate beadwork and quillwork that represented her journey from captive to tribe member. Every woman in the village contributed something to the dress, a few beads here, some quills there, each addition a blessing and an acceptance. Winterwolf prepared gifts for her family and for the tribe, horses and blankets and weapons, items that demonstrated his wealth and ability to provide. He also worked on building an addition to their teepee, expanding it to accommodate a growing family. The entire village buzzed with preparation for the wedding, which would be a major celebration. The night before the ceremony, according to custom, Carrie stayed in Morning Rain's teepee, separated from Winterwolf. The women of the tribe gathered there for a ceremony of their own, welcoming Carrie fully into the circle of Comanche women. They sang songs about marriage and children, about strength and survival, about the sacred role of women in maintaining the tribe. Stands in Storm painted symbols on Carrie's skin with red ochre, marks of protection and fertility. They told her what to expect on her wedding night with a frankness that made her blush, but also made her feel included in the sisterhood of wives. They gave her advice about managing a household, about keeping a husband happy, about raising children in the Comanche way. It was an intimate gathering, full of laughter and wisdom, and Carrie felt the final walls between her and these women crumble. She was one of them now, truly. The wedding day dawned clear and beautiful, the spring sky brilliant blue, the air warm and sweet with the scent of flowers. The entire tribe gathered in the center of the village circle, dressed in their finest clothing. Winterwolf stood waiting, wearing new leggings and a shirt his sisters had made, his long hair adorned with feathers and beads, his face painted with symbols of honor and courage. He looked magnificent, and when Carrie emerged from Morning Rain's teepee in her white wedding dress, his expression transformed into something almost reverent. She walked toward him slowly, her heart pounding, very aware of all the eyes watching her. This was the moment that would define her new life. The point of no return. Stands in Storm performed the ceremony, calling on the spirits to bless this union, speaking of the sacred bond between man and woman, reminding them of their responsibilities to each other and to the tribe. She bound their hands together with leather strips decorated with beads, symbolizing their lives intertwining. Winter Wolf and Carrie spoke vows to each other, his voice strong and certain, hers quieter but equally firm. He promised to protect her, provide for her, honor her as his partner. She promised to support him, stand beside him, bear his children, and raise them in the ways of his people. They exchanged gifts, he giving her a horse of her own, a beautiful roan mare, and she giving him a bow she had made with her own hands, the arrows she had crafted under his tutelage. The gifts represented their commitment to supporting each other's endeavors. When Stands in Storm pronounced them married in the eyes of the tribe and the spirits, the gathered people erupted in celebration. Drums began to beat, voices rose in song, people danced and celebrated the union. A great feast had been prepared, the best food available after the long winter, and everyone ate and drank and made merry. Winter Wolf and Carrie sat together in the place of honor, accepting congratulations and blessings from tribe members. Even Broken Lance, who had opposed their union, came forward to offer grudging respect, acknowledging that Carrie had proven herself more worthy than he had expected. As the sun set and the celebration continued under the stars, Winter Wolf leaned close to Carrie and whispered that he was the most fortunate man alive. She smiled and told him she felt the same way, that against all odds and expectations, she had found happiness again. That night, they retired to their teepee as husband and wife, and what transpired there was tender and meaningful, a physical expression of the emotional bond they had built over months of getting to know each other. Carrie had been nervous, uncertain what to expect, but Winter Wolf was gentle and patient, making sure she felt safe and cared for. Afterward, lying in his arms in the darkness, she reflected on the impossible journey that had brought her to this moment. She had lost everything, had been dragged into captivity expecting death or worse, had every reason to give up and surrender to despair. Instead, she had found resilience she did not know she possessed. She had adapted and learned and grown. She had opened her heart when it would have been easier to keep it closed. And now she was married to a man she loved, accepted by a community that valued her, building a new life from the ashes of the old. The months and years that followed were not without challenges. There were conflicts with white settlers that sometimes turned violent, forcing the tribe to move to new hunting grounds. There were hard winters and lean times when food was scarce. There were losses when beloved tribe members died from disease or violence. But through it all, Carrie stood beside Winter Wolf as his partner and equal. She bore him 3 children over the years, 2 sons and a daughter, teaching them both Comanche ways and stories of their mother's people so they would understand both sides of their heritage. She became known in the tribe as a skilled healer, learning medicine craft from Stands in Storm before the old woman passed peacefully in her sleep. She was respected for her wisdom, her strength, and her unwavering loyalty. Sometimes, in quiet moments, Carrie would think about her parents and brother, about the life she might have lived if that terrible morning had never happened. She mourned them still, carried their memory in her heart always. But she also recognized that tragedy had led her to a life she never could have imagined, one that was rich and full in ways her old life might never have been. She had become someone stronger, more capable, more connected to the natural world and to a community that valued every member. When people asked her about her past, about how she had come to be Comanche, she would tell them the truth. She would say that she had been given a choice between death and life, and a warrior named Winter Wolf had shown her that life was worth choosing. Even when everything seemed lost, as she grew older, her hair beginning to show streaks of gray, her face marked with lines earned through years of laughter and hardship. Carrie would sometimes stand at the edge of the village and look out across the endless prairie. She would remember the girl she had been, kneeling in the dirt, begging for death, too broken to imagine a future. And she would think about the woman she had become, a survivor, a wife, a mother, a healer, a full member of the Comanche people. Her journey had been impossible and painful and transformative. She had crossed a divide that few ever crossed, had built a bridge between two worlds in her own heart. And though the world around her continued to change, though the conflicts between settlers and Comanche grew more intense with each passing year, she had found her place, her purpose, her home. Winterwolf would come to stand beside her in those moments, his hand finding hers as naturally as breathing, and together they would watch the sun set over the land they both loved. Two souls who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful from tragedy. The story of Caroline Wells and Winterwolf is more than just a tale of survival in the untamed West. It is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, to our capacity to rebuild when everything we know is torn away, to find light even in the darkest moments. Carrie's journey from a terrified captive begging for death to a respected member of the Comanche tribe shows us that identity is not fixed, that we can become someone entirely new when circumstances demand it. Her story challenges the simple narratives of heroes and villains that dominated frontier history, reminding us that human beings on both sides of any conflict are complex, capable of both cruelty and extraordinary kindness. What makes this story particularly powerful is how it illustrates the healing power of human connection. Winterwolf could have left Carrie to her fate that day, could have ridden past without intervening in what appeared to be white man's business. Instead, he chose compassion, chose to see her suffering and respond to it, setting in motion a chain of events that would transform both their lives. His decision to protect her, to bring her into his community, to open his heart to someone from an enemy people, required tremendous courage. Similarly, Carrie's choice to accept the life offered to her, to learn new ways, to open herself to loving again after devastating loss, showed remarkable bravery. Both of them had to overcome prejudices, fears, and the weight of history to build something meaningful together. Their story also speaks to the broader tragedy of the American frontier, a time when two cultures collided with devastating consequences for indigenous peoples. The Comanche way of life that Carrie joined was already under enormous pressure by the 1860s, with buffalo herds declining, settlers pushing ever westward, and the U.S. government pursuing policies designed to force Native Americans onto reservations. Within a few decades of the time period in this story, the free-roaming Comanche lifestyle would be largely ended. Understanding this historical context makes Carrie and Winterwolf's brief moment of happiness even more poignant. They carved out love and family and community during a time of tremendous upheaval, finding personal peace even as the world around them grew increasingly chaotic. The themes in this story resonate far beyond the specific historical moment. How many of us have faced our own moments of devastating loss, times when everything familiar was stripped away, and we had to find the strength to continue? How many have had to adapt to entirely new circumstances, learn new skills, integrate into unfamiliar communities? Carrie's experience, though extreme, reflects universal human experiences of grief, adaptation, and eventual healing. Her story reminds us that we are more resilient than we often believe, that we can survive things we think will destroy us, that new chapters can begin even after the most painful endings. Winterwolf's character also offers important lessons. In a time and place where violence was common and showing mercy to enemies was often seen as weakness, he chose a different path. He recognized Carrie's humanity when he could have dismissed her as merely an enemy. He protected her when abandoning her would have been easier. He fell in love without regard for the social complications such a relationship would create. His willingness to follow his heart despite practical obstacles, to claim Carrie as his wife despite opposition from some tribe members, demonstrates that love requires not just feeling but courage, the willingness to stand by your choices even when others disapprove. The secondary characters in this story also played crucial roles. Morning Rain's friendship gave Carrie a lifeline during her most vulnerable period, teaching her not just language and skills, but showing her that belonging was possible. Stands in Storm's wisdom and ultimate acceptance provided the community blessing that made Carrie's integration legitimate. Even those who initially opposed her presence, like Broken Lance, eventually came to respect her when she proved her commitment. These relationships illustrate how communities function,